I'm getting used to the idea of the technology that people will send me pictures of their whatever.
The lighting can be difficult sometimes, though. That's why I asked.
Yeah, I do need to be able to see what it looks like, of course. But, I mean, it's kind of interesting. There are mistakes that people make that instantly leap out at you that you realize, oh, they didn't get it. You know? But that's good, because that way I can go back over what the individuals have missed, and try to make sure that they get them, so that we can move on to the next interesting step, which is fun too. By the way, I did want to mention, with all the stuff going on with the university, I have no clue any more than anyone else. So you know, what I've heard from everyone is, write your legislator, you know, call them, beg them to override the veto. And so until we find out if that actually can happen, nobody really knows for sure.
I've heard that, but I mean, I may just be ignorant. The blanket statement of call your legislature, I mean, who do you contact? The House of Representative members?
Oh,
the Senate
well,
members?
like on email at least, a lot of people are posting certain individuals that they feel like they're reasonable people that currently are expected to vote with Dunleavy instead of against. So those would be the ones to call to try to tip the balance one way or the other.
I gotcha.
I have one friend who's down in Chile on his sabbatical, Travis Rector. He's an astronomer, and he was on sabbatical this year. And for his sabbatical, he spent half the year in, I think, Mount Palomar or Arizona, some U.S. location with a telescope. And then the second half of the year, which is now, he's down in Chile in the mountains with their telescopes. And I asked him, do you even have a chance of getting a ticket back? And his answer was the same, not unless you call your legislator. So, pins and needles, especially if your jobs are...
Yeah. We need a multi-millionaire to start donating to UAA.
We don't have... Well, Rasmussen family is pretty close, but they typically don't donate most of their donations to the state. If you've traveled around the country, you'll notice that the Rasmussens donate, like at the museum, the National Museum of the American Indian, the main theater on the first floor is the Rasmussen Theater. So they give money. More power to them, right? You know, but and they're pretty important, of course, in Alaska too. But when you get right down to it, that's one of the reasons Alaska's in somewhat of a different situation than a lot of other states, because we don't have people that have lived here, that many, that have lived here multiple generations and have established a great deal of wealth and are Alaskan residents. You know, so a lot of the people that did make money left. You know, it's like they came up here to make money and then they left. And so if they're donating money to other places, it's somewhere down in the lower 48 that they feel associated with. And I understand that. I mean, I get letters and emails from all my, the institutions I attended. You know, and I can see why, the attraction would be to, send money to your college, to your, high school. My 70th reunion of my grammar school is in July, and I'm like, who goes back to the 70th anniversary of the grammar school? That's weird.
Like primary school?
Right. My school was in grade 1 through 8, with nuns that looked like Darth Vader.
Oh, nice. Did they have the voice box?
They did. They did. Yeah, I know where George Lucas got the idea for Darth Vader. It was Sister Mary Immaculate. Yes, I know all of that. Did I turn this on? Yeah, I got that on. So that's but so the University of Alaska doesn't have a large donor pool because it's only 50 years old, roughly. The Harvard alumni, on the other hand, have donated billions of dollars. Theoretically, you could apply and go to Harvard without paying tuition. They have enough money in their fund to cover everything.
Wow.
In fact, I'm not even sure how the tuition system works, I guess.
They want more money? I mean, it's a
People do,
for-profit college.
yeah, well, of course, people do still pay tuition, of course, to go. It makes sense. And by the way, and I recommend a lot of young students that haven't gone very far to apply to Harvard because they like the idea of having students from Alaska.
Really?
Yeah, because there's not that many of us, we're really pretty small. And so if you're doing well, you're a good student, and you apply to Harvard, the chances are good because they don't necessarily just use geniosity as your admission ticket, right? It's also who you are and where you're from. That they will, of course they're in trouble for the mechanisms that they use to decide all of that. Because in some people's cases it works out well for them, in other people's cases, we've got too many of you. So yeah, we'll take some of you, but not all of you, because, we don't want to become Beijing University. We still want to have some sort of an American character,
Was Harvard the one who was, admonished for being too hard on the Asian students?
Yes.
It was Harvard?
Wasn't it was a reverse affirmative action because there were so many top of their class Asian
Right.
kids who were wanting to get
Right.
in?
That apparently is the case. Yeah.
I gotcha.
They were putting the lid on how many they would take because they would become dominantly Asian.
They're too
Which,
smart.
I mean, that was something about Charles Murray's book too. Is the IQ tests statistically indicate that the smartest people, IQ wise, are what do you call people from China and maybe Japan and maybe some other places in that area. I don't know.
I'm not.
Asian, I guess. But of course, a lot of them are actually Americans.
Asian American?
I suppose we could say that. I don't know. Francis Fukuyama, what do you say he is? I mean, he was born in the United States, but I don't know what I am, actually, when you get right down to it. I'm homeless, basically. But not in the sense that I don't have a place to live. I'm homeless in the sense that I don't have a ethnicity. I mean, I don't think of myself as Irish, even though I'm part Irish. I don't think of myself as Scottish, even though I'm part Scottish. I don't think of myself as English, even though apparently I'm somewhat English. I'm also French, Swedish. My mother's, the gene thing says that we're part Sami. Have you ever heard of them? They're the people that live in the farthest north of Finland and Norway.
part of milking
sheep
pond.
herders or reindeer herders, I guess. So, yeah, I don't know. But I never lived or even visited any of those places. Germany, I've been to Germany. Okay. So, let's do a couple.
Looks like everyone's out barbecuing today.
So, OAO3, one of my favorites, I guess. And it's 3, so 1, 2, 3. So that should be the written out version of that named syllogism, OAO3. And if I want to draw a, how have we been doing it? That way? I get them both ways. Flip it either way. It's best to use just one particular pattern, and I think I mentioned that he screwed me up because he flipped them compared to the way I used to do them, but I think he does it this way.
Are you talking about the author of the book?
Right.
Okay.
But the important thing is that you get used to a particular pattern. But so if this, is this the way I've been doing them?
No, you did it the
I-
other way.
I
You were
did it
doing
the other way? Sorry, does that confuse you? Doesn't, I mean, what the goal of the Venn diagram is for you to have in this case the conclusion is down here. And I'm looking at the two premises this way. But so sum M is not P. I'll skip that one and go to the minor premise first, because that gives me a lot more information. All M is S, so there's no members in M that are not also in this section. Notice that covers these two areas that are S, right? That's in the circle that's S, right? And then I can go back to the major premise. Sum M is not P, so it would not be in here, so it has to be in here. And then I look at the conclusion and see if it's already drawn, and in this case, sum S is not P, and so this is an example of something that is S. It's also M. It's the M that is not P, right? And it's also not P in that case, so this is an S that's not P, so I can see that this is a valid form. And it's kind of interesting, if you look at the valid forms in the book, in the chart, which somebody pointed out was what, I thought it was 357, but that's way the heck too far. 237 maybe. Yeah. So if we look for those that are OAO, so OAO3, thought there were a couple that were like that. So the others are like EAO3. Now, when you look at the ones that are on page 238, notice those are syllogisms that are valid on the traditional system, but not on the modern system. And the reason for that is the premises are both universal but the conclusion is O, which is a particular statement, right? But so you have OAO and you also have EAO, 3, are both valid, although EAO 3, of course, would be invalid because of the existential fallacy. But you get the idea. It's still giving you the same kind of information that if this had been no S is P, right? No S is P, you would have had, I'm sorry, no M is P, right? No M is P. We would have had this filled in here, right? And all M is S. So some S is not P would still be valid, right?
So X is supposed to go in,
Yeah,
should be, we got two different spaces,
Right,
or areas for X.
if I had EAO3, I wouldn't have an X, but I would have this filled in for this one, right?
Right.
But Aristotle says, well, but you have to have a member
So we have to choose
in
one.
M, so there would be an X.
So we don't have to write X on that
You
line.
don't, yeah, you don't write an X for this. For this one, you do. Because this one says some M is not P,
Right.
and there's the M that's not P. Because if it were over here, it would be P. But so when we're thinking about what these represent in mathematical patterns in our communication, notice the relationship between these. This gives you more information than this. Remember, because the E statement gives you the most information in any premise. The A statement is next. The O statement is third. And the I statement is the most wishy-washy premise. Some Republicans are okay. Okay, so that's fun. But let's pick one that's invalid. AIO. I know immediately that this is invalid because I have affirmative premises and I have a negative conclusion. So I know that's going to be invalid. So since it's 2, it's 1, 2. Oops, sorry. All P is M, some S is M. Which also points out that my middle term is undistributed also. So all P is M. There's no members of P that are up here. Some S is M, which means it's going to be on the line, because I don't know whether it's in here or in here. So my conclusion, some S is not P, is not given. I don't have an X in either place. God bless you. So that's invalid. And I mentioned that it's undistributed middle. And we also have a negative conclusion. But affirmative. Premises. This is distributed here, but this is distributed here. So I don't have illicit major, nor is it illicit minor. I don't have exclusive premises, because I don't have any negative premises at all. And you see when I'm trying to figure out where do I draw the X, it's going to be some place ambiguous, because some S is M. Has to be in M, and it has to be in S, but I don't know whether it also is P or not. That information is. So, go ahead and do, I think, did everybody get, you got all 15 of the questions? So you could do them, turn them in either by picture, via email, if email still works, after the 15th, I don't know.
What's going on?
Oh, it's the university has been defunded, as far as we know. Yes?
Oh, it's ending completely on the 15th.
Well, the 15th is when the paperwork will be completed so that the university can declare financial exigency,
Oh, okay.
at which point that means they're bankrupt and they can fire everybody.
Of this month.
Yes. Unless the legislature vetoes the veto, which is possible, I suppose.
When will they know that?
Pardon?
When will they know, like, when is the veto supposed to happen?
Well, they're supposed to get back together for a special session, and I think July 5th is when they're supposed to show up, but they're still arguing over that, because the governor wants them in Wasilla, where the people in Wasilla who are notorious for beating people up that they don't agree with. I'm just picking on Wasilla.
Oh, you said it, not me.
That was meant to be funny, you know. And I'm assuming that even the folks in Wasilla would know that it was funny, because I did record that so that, you know, and they know where I live.
The elected Sarah Palin, so we either have a really good or bad sense.
You know, I like Sarah, actually.
She's an interesting lady.
She is. I've met her a couple times, and you know, I thought she was a good average American. Gave a nice speech or two here or there. I bought a copy of her book, and she signed it for me. Yes. It's not my fault. It's just true.
During her time in office, I had to defend Alaskans so many times down in California, just because everyone's like, "Oh yeah, you all are brain dead."
And I use her word, although at the moment I can't remember what it was. Began with an R. Another word she invented.
It's astonishing how many people think that she actually said that she could see Russia from her house. It's like, guys, that was an SNL skit. What are you doing?
I gave a presentation once where I was talking about when I lived in Berlin, and I showed the picture of the mess hall, which was on Teufelsberg, and from there you can see Poland. And I just, at the time I said, we could see Poland from my house. Everybody laughed. Refudiate. Yes, that was it. Thank you. Yeah. Refudiate. You can't refudiate it. Of course, we get kofif from the president-in-chief. So we get some really cool. I love Americans. I think we're great. Even if I can't complain that some Americans are buffoonish, because after all, I'm pretty darn close to the caricature of I've got the outfit and all that stuff. Oh well. And I love Jesus. And Jesus obviously was a great comedian. He told lots of great jokes. Most people don't realize they were jokes. They miss them. You know why he didn't make it to college? He got hung up on the boards.
Oh, dude. That's rough.
I like it.
Oh, well. Okay. So work on syllogisms, and we can go back to them to go over them. But turn in the test when you get the chance, so that you get your A for test 2. By the way, that also would mean that you'd at least have a C for the course, even if you can't come back for any of the other tests or the rest of it, because that's half of the grade by then, right? So just saying, can't imagine anybody wanting to drop the course, when you already have passed the course. So don't do that, because the next part might be even more confusing. And a lot of people say, "Oh, I can't do it," and then they never come back, and I don't know why that is. So.
I don't have a grade for it yet. So I couldn't really fail for any reason. It's just posted on Blackboard.
Well, so moving on to chapter 7. And so now what we're doing is propositional logic. And I suppose even before we get into this, I'll first point out that I'm sure everybody, as we were doing syllogisms, thought, well, I've never met anyone that talked this way or argued this way. So syllogisms in that sense certainly feels unusual to you, I would think, right? And I'm sure that was the case even for Aristotle. Remember, in Aristotle's categories, he describes the way grammar works. So he's talking about the absolute base for reason, for how we argue. He's not saying that is actually how we argue in practice, right? So we're not expecting you to start arguing in court, using this format, because everyone would look, at you like you're weird, because you would be, right? Instead, we use everyday speech. So the question then is, what's the way that we embed syllogisms in our everyday speech? And do we have to speak that way? And since most people would find this excruciating to try to break their arguments down to syllogisms, around World War I, the end of World War I or thereabouts, into World War II, various individuals, some of whom are highlighted in the text, began creating a different system, which now, of course, we call symbolic logic, or in this chapter titled Propositional Logic. And the thing was, okay, assume that we've got statements that we could call P and Q. P and Q are just variables that stand for any statement that's true or false, which of course means your A, E, I, O statements, right? So it could be any of them. And what happens in everyday speech is we use what are referred to as logical operators.
Solving for cosine is an algebra problem. Solving for theta is a trigonometry problem. We're trying to figure out what angle measure.
And when it comes to figuring out what logical operators there are, we have, for example, N. And N can be said in lots of different ways. We can say but. And I think there's a list of words that can be N.
Chapter 7, page 309.
You have lots of different translations here for different things. Oh, conjunction is page 310. But you can have lots of ways in everyday speech that we say N without literally saying N. But what we mean is the same thing logically as N. So the question, of course, is, well, what does N stand for logically? And there's of course, a variety as it explains here. But so if I take a variable of any statement that can be true or false, call it P, and since it can be either true or false, I can say that P is either true or false. And if I have Q, and Q can be either true or false, then I have to keep in mind that for every time I add another variable, I add another true or false possibility. And so we end up with a little rule that says 2 to the n, where n stands for the number of variables in your statement, your thought process, whatever, right? So why would that be the case? Well, if I have just P, and so that would be 2 to the 1, then I would have 2 possibilities, true, false. But if I have 2, then it would be 2 to the second power, which would give me 4. Well, why 4? Well, if I have both P and Q are true, both P and Q are false, I could also have P is true and Q is false, right? Or I could have P is false and Q is true.
So you can either directly factor this, you can rewrite this above one as
Now I have all of the logical possibilities for two statements, both of which can be true or false, right? So I have 2 to the 2 would be 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? If I had P, Q, R, then I would have to have 8 possibilities. And notice for all of these, I would have to have this duplicated for when R is false, etc. Yes.
So does the n equal, like you said, the total amount of possibilities here, true or false?
So the
Or just how many times there is true or false?
So the n in for just P would be 1. For 2 would be 2, which would give me 4 possibilities, 4 rows. 3, 2 to the third would be 8, right? So I would have 8 sets of possibilities. Computers can handle that fine, up to an unlimited amount, depending on the speed of the computer, right? It gets difficult for us after you run out of board space in class, right? But so that's how we figure out how big our, what we call our table, our truth table, has to be when we're figuring this out. But now that I have the basis for how a truth table is set up, say I just have 2, and I'm trying to figure out what end means. What does end mean? So let me do it this way. TF, TF, TT, F, F. That's just a neat, you can set up whichever your favorite pattern is. Notice Stan uses a particular pattern in the book. Again, he changed it from the way I'm used to as a kid, because I used the copy text as a kid, and I thought that it still is a more logical way of saying that. But in any case, you just want to have a pattern so you know all the logical possibilities for 2 statements. And then I can come over here and I can say, so P and Q. If I have a compound statement of 2 statements that are true or false, under what circumstances does n end up making a compound statement true? Well, it would be the case when both the left and the right are true. But if either the left or the right is false, it would be false. So the only time that a statement, a compound statement, is true, that is P and Q, is when both P and Q are true. And that's what n means as a logical operator, that the only time the compound statement is true is when both the left and the right are true. So, for example, if I say Hillary Clinton is the Secretary of State and Donald Trump is the President, that is false, because Hillary Clinton is not the Secretary of State. Even though Donald Trump is President, my compound statement that said both are the case was false. Right? It is true that, what did we, Mike Palumbo, not Palumbo? I forgot. I went home and I checked it. Pompeo. I went home and I checked it, and then here it is, what, a week later. And he's been in the news several times this week. And I did it, I forgot him again. But in any case, Mike Pompeo is Secretary of State, not Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense right now is kind of, we don't know exactly. And Donald Trump is president. That compound statement is true, because both the left and the right are true.
So in this section of logic, not only are we taking into the idea of categorical syllogisms, but also truth value as we're jumping into that, correct?
We call them truth values, but what we're looking at really is the logical characteristic of these logical operators that we use in everyday speech.
Okay.
To make our, because we're not talking in syllogisms, we're not talking in little categorical statements. Instead, we're much more elaborate and confusing.
Gotcha.
But we still want to evaluate those great big statements and break them down into the little true false statements. And now we have to concern ourselves with the logical operators that we use to compile all of those,
Okay.
right? And is one of those. Right? We'll do a couple others, but and is one, right? And so this is the definition of the logical operator that we could call and, but in the book we will also call the dot. So the dot operator. And basically the dot operator, the meaning of it is true when both the left and the right are true. So when you use but or and, also, you know, cars is over there and Walmart is also over there. That whole thing is true if it's both the case that cars is over there and Walmart is over there. If I say cars is over there and Walmart is on the other side of the Glen Highway, that's false, because I gave you the wrong directions for the Walmart, right? But notice you don't say, oh, the first part of what you said is true, because the cars is over there, but the second part you said, that's wrong. You could do that, but basically you would say, oh, you're wrong. The whole thing is wrong, because half of it was wrong, and saying also means and means I've got to do both correctly, or I screwed up. So this is a connector, a logical operator, lots of words for it, right? And in the book we'll also refer to it as the dot operator. But what if I said or instead? That's a different operator in English. And in the book we also refer to it as the wedge operator. And what does the wedge operator mean? Well, if I have the left and the right, if both of them are true, then the whole thing is true. You might disagree with me about that. That's kind of interesting. If the right side is true, then the whole thing is true, even if the left side is false. If the left side is true, the whole thing is true, even though the right side is false. The only time this statement will be false is when both the left and the right are false.
Doesn't or kind of imply that if they're both true, then the or isn't the right word to use?
Well, this is where it's interesting that culturally not everybody feels comfortable saying or with this meaning. Because some people will want to say, well, no, wait a minute, this is also false. So the difference is inclusive or exclusive. And all logical systems use the inclusive. And here's my attempt at arguing why. If I use the exclusive use, there are some things I couldn't say that we would like to be able to say. And I wouldn't be able to do it. Whereas if I have the inclusive use of the logical operator, I can say everything I want to say, including the things that feel odd to you, right?
Well, that inclusive, I get what you mean. So like if you wanted to say we could have this for dinner or that for dinner and they would both be good, then it doesn't
Right,
mean.
right. So the way I think of it is if I go to a restaurant with my kids and it's a all-you-can-eat buffet, and I just pay one price, which is great for hobbits, you know, when you bring them in, because hobbits, you know, they like to eat and eat and eat. But the restaurants do get upset with you if you like drop your kids off in the morning and then don't come back until the evening. You know? They mean per meal, you know, not the whole day, right? Even if they're open the whole day, you can't just drop your kids off. Eat. Eat all you want. You only get one day you can eat, the rest of the week you're fasting, you know, and then we'll come back. No, that's not how even hobbits eat, right? But so if I'm at that kind of restaurant and I tell the kids, yes, if you eat your dinner for dessert, you can have apple pie or peach pie or rhubarb pie or what, right? And I actually mean, yeah, if all you can eat, you know, go ahead, yeah, have a slice of this, have a slice of that. So I'm using the word or, but I'm saying, yes, you can have that one, yes, you can have that one. On the other hand, I could have gone to the Sheraton, where they have gold silverware and white linen napkins, and charge you $5 for an orange juice. And that was back in 1987, so I don't know what they charge anymore. But when you look at the menu there and you know you're going to pay per pat of butter, right? That's when you tell your child, okay, after you eat your breakfast, because you can't afford dinner there, right? You know, you can have peach pie or apple pie or pumpkin, you know, whatever. Now you mean one or the other, but not both. The thing is, even if I'm using the inclusive or, I can still say what I would have meant by using the exclusive or by saying, but, which is and, not both.
Not even the tangent of beta. When I am after you guys.
But oddly, if I use the exclusive or for the or, meaning of or, I couldn't say that you could use this or this and both.
Over here, we knew what sine of beta was, and from that, we were able to figure out what cosine of beta was by using sine.
Does that make sense?
Cosine is greater than equal.
At least that's the argument. You might say, well, you just said and both. Isn't that the whole thing? I think so. But I'm trying to pull the wool over your eyes and act like, no, this is actually a good argument. In any case, it's the one you hear from all the books that explain why we don't use the exclusive or, we use the inclusive or. But it also comes up in another way, in another logical operator that makes it feel strange, and we'll see that when we get to it too. And I actually feel like there's kind of a cultural difference why some people use it that way. That's kind of interesting. But so we do have this difference, but in logic books, we use the inclusive or, which means that the definition of the wedge is a truth table where both the left and the right can be true and the statement is still true. The only time it will be false is when both the left and the right are false. And then the wedge operator is false. Another one that we have,
Sorry, just, you had mentioned exclusive and inclusive uses of or. So if or is inclusive, what is its real definition aside from and? I would see the two
oh,
as being
it's different than and,
synonymous.
because and, the only time that your compound statement is true is when both the left and the right are true. Whereas with the wedge, it's true not only in this case, it's also true here where just one side is true. And it's also true here where just the other side is true. Whereas the dot operator, it would be false here and false here.
Okay.
So that's the difference,
All right.
right? Then the other logical operator we have is not. And we use a little tilde key. If you look at the QWERTY keyboard, the top left shift, top left is, oops, sorry, is not. Oh, by the way, these are fonts that could be changed depending on the text, etc. We'll see that. Although I think when you learn the patterns, you understand them regardless of which font the editor actually uses for something. You'll see the pattern when you pick it up. I'm pretty sure. So what's the difference with not? And why would you call it a connector? Because strictly speaking, it's not connecting. So I can't say P not Q. I have to have and or when I do two variables and I'm connecting them. But when I use not, I can put it in front of something and it's still called a connector or a logical operator because it changes the truth value of this. So if P is true, not P is false. If P is false, not P is true. And since I have the table here, so since I have P on the table, even though there's only two possibilities, we have it duplicated, so I'll duplicate it over here and notice that the whole point of not, very intuitive, right? You know, so if someone says, it's snowing, not, right? You know, that, you know, I just said it's false that it is snowing. Right? So if you're thinking it is snowing, true or false? It's false. But if I say not, it's snowing, then that's true, because it's not snowing. I messed that up. So not is a logical operator. So we have three. We have the dot, we have the wedge, and we have the tilde, right? As connectors, which is odd because we might not say this connects anything. Although there are situations. So for example, I can have not P. I can use the negation that way. I could also have not P and Q. And now what am I looking at when I'm looking at that? Well, if I look at my table, since this is not P, this would be false for this first row, true for the second, false for the third, true for the fourth, and Q is true. I'm just taking it from there, right? True, true, false, false. And so now if I'm looking at the combination of this, and I know that the dot means that it's only going to be true when both the left and the right are true, then I can see that it's true here, but false here, and false here. Right? So the compound statement, not P and Q, is only true when it's false that P and Q. Notice though, if I put parentheses around P and Q, that changes what this says, because now it should be read, it is not the case that P and Q. Because now the negation sign negates the compound statement P and Q.
Right.
And so,
What about tangent and cotangent? Well, if we take the sine squared of theta plus the cosine
looking at that table, I have
both sides.
true, false, false for P, right? And I have true, false, false for Q, right? And I'm looking at the conjunction of the two of them in the parentheses, right? So it would be true here, false here, and false here, right? Then I look at the negation sign, and the negation sign negates the truth value of the compound statement inside the parentheses. So it gives me false, true, true, true. So not the case P and Q is false when both P and Q are true. True when either P is false or Q is false, and it's true when both are false. Because it says not the case P and Q. So I'm saying it's not the case that both P and Q are true. Well, it's true to say that, whether it's the case that both P and Q are false, or one or the other is false. It would only be false if it's true that P and Q. So that's fine.
Now would be a good time for chapter 3 questions. Probably won't make it all the way to the whole 4.2, but that's fine. This is the last time you're looking at math class. This is the last page we have our test on. Anything that
So how about another interesting logical operator? We have if P, then Q. So this is read if P, then Q, right? It's referred to as the horseshoe operator because of this shape. Some fonts, because they don't have the horseshoe, they use maybe an arrow. You might see that.
I wouldn't recommend
In any
anything
case.
else but
So if P then Q, And you wonder, okay, so what does that mean? So if I have true, false, true, false, true, false, false is my table, because I have two statements, two variables, right? If P, then Q is considered true. If P, when P is false, but Q is true, we say that the whole compound statement is true. It's only when, if P is true but Q is false, that we say the whole thing is false. And oddly, if P is false and Q is false, we say the whole thing is true. Because if the moon is made out of green cheese, then everything follows. Kind of like when Nietzsche said, if God is dead, then everything goes, right? Which, in an interesting sense, would be, well, but God is not dead, hopefully. And so it's not the case that everything follows. Remember, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Since God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, then God must exist, in which case it's false to say that God doesn't exist, that God is dead, etc. Notice that doesn't define God in any other sense. It's just annoying to people. Okay? But so this is strange. Think of it this way. If I tell my son I'll give him a quarter if he takes out the trash, and then he takes out the trash. I'll give you a quarter if you take out the trash. He takes out the trash. And so he, I'm not lying to him, I'm telling him the truth. I will give him a quarter if he takes out the trash. And he does actually take out the trash, right? Then that statement is true. I didn't lie to him, I'll give him a quarter. Tell how old this example is. Who gives their kid a quarter for taking it? Today, if they take out one trash can, it's $25 or they won't do it, right?
So that's how old they are.
10, no.
You spoil them. Spoil them rotten.
I am kidding.
Little kids can get amped on those little quarter machines with the candy.
Well, you know what? They don't.
Super pumped.
Remember the Tooth Fairy? $10. I found my mother and father's check for $10 under the. They screwed up the Tooth Fairy. Sorry, it's Greek joke. Were you here that night when we did the Greek? Okay, so give you a quarter if you take out the trash. Takes out the trash. True. In the case where the situation where it becomes false is where, wait, so I'm reversing it. I want to say, if you take out the trash, then I will give you a quarter. Okay, so he takes out the trash and I gave him a quarter. So that's true. In the case though where he doesn't take out the trash, but the next time I see him I give him a quarter anyway, is he going to be mad at me for lying to him? Hey Dad, you said you'd give me a quarter if I took out the trash, but I didn't take out the trash and you're giving me a quarter? No, that would never happen. Chris would absolutely be thrilled to death that he got the quarter anyway, right? So he's not going to say, you lied to me, because I did it that way, right? But if he took out the trash and came back and said, I took out the trash, and I said, oh, well, don't have a quarter, sorry, he would be pissed off. And rightfully so, because I lied to him. False, right? If he doesn't take out the trash, and I don't give him a quarter, he's still not gonna be mad at me. I might be upset, because, then the trash cup comes the next day, and our trash is still sitting, in our bear-proof bin, so the trash truck can't take our trash. We end up with twice the trash next week, right? But so the only time it would be false is if the left side is true and the right side is false. And this side is referred to as the antecedent. In this conditional state, this is referred to as a conditional statement, and this is referred to as the consequent.
I'm still confused on the second. Can you give like another example of when the antecedent is false and the the second part
Doesn't even have to be like, the examples will shy away from causality, because we really don't want causality to be a part of it. But it could be other things like, if the Chinese build an island in the Pacific, then the Philippines will be upset. That's still causal related, right? But so, in the situation where the Chinese build the island, then the Philippines are upset, then your statement was true. Right? If the Chinese don't build the island, but the Philippines are still upset, you're still speaking truthfully.
But you're saying something that was false though, in the first
The
part.
first part of it was false. Turned out not to happen. But no one will be critical of you, because it could have been the case. Because you still could have been right. Does that make sense? Right? On the other hand, if the Chinese do build the island, and the Filipinos could care less, they'll criticize you for being wrong in your theory that there would be that relationship. On the other hand, if the Chinese don't build the island and the Philippine government isn't upset, then no one's going to come back on you and say your theory was wrong, because your theory hasn't been shown to be wrong. Right? The only way it would be shown to be wrong is if the Chinese did build the island, but no one in the Philippines got upset. It's actually Indonesia that would be upset, right? You're from the, right? They built an island in the ocean. So the Chinese are, we're running out of room. Well, let's build some more land. And so they just started dumping sand in a place in the ocean until it was full of sand, and now they've got a runway and cannons and.
OC Renewal was for military advantage to have presence in the area.
Right. It was open area, and now the Chinese are claiming it.
I thought it was just fake oil.
That could, well, that area I think is possibly oil.
I mean, they would just build an oil platform, right? They don't need to build an island.
Because they want the rights to the oil future,
Right,
not
right.
So
necessarily.
you get what, a certain amount of nautical miles away from your land?
Right.
For
For international law. So.
that makes sense.
Cool idea, though. You think of it.
I don't know why they need it. They're world power. They can just take whatever they want.
Well, probably not a good idea.
Probably not a good idea.
Okay, so that's another. I don't know if that example helps, but we'll do do lots of this. So the interesting thing about this operator is the meaning of that operator is this truth table under these conditions. Now, an interesting thing about this logical operator is we don't actually need it. And the reason we don't actually need it is because if we look at this compound statement, not the case P or Q, right, this whole thing, and compare it to this whole thing. So not P using this table would be false, true, false, true. Q is true, true, false, false. Right? The wedge, remember, is true as long as one side or the other is true. It's only false when both the left and the right are false. So this compound statement's truth value is this for this truth table, right? Now compare this to this, and notice that they're identical. In other words, they're logically equivalent. So, we don't actually need the horseshoe. All we really would have to do is just whenever we wanted to use the horseshoe, say not the case P or Q, and that would be the logical equivalence using the horseshoe. So that means that we didn't actually need this, but most logical systems will use it anyway, even though it's additional, because it helps translate our usual statements from everyday speech. Because that sounds weird to us when we say this, right? And the reason it sounds weird to us, I think, is because a lot of people like the exclusive use of or. So, you know, if you take out the trash, then I'll give you a quarter, right? It would be quite different. It's, you know, if I say, either it's not the case that you take out the trash, or I give you a quarter. Right? That would be confusing to my son Chris. He wouldn't know what are you trying to say, Dad? Spit it out, you know, right? Take out the trash. That's what I really want you to do.
So the negation only applies to P, right? Not both.
Right. It only, so I'm saying it's not the case P or Q, because when you look at the truth values here, right? In the case where it's not the case P, but you still have Q that's true, right? This would be the one case where it'll be false, and here it's still going to be true. So that is the logical equivalence of saying if P then Q. It's just that it doesn't feel in English the same way as saying if the moon is made out of green cheese, then Hillary Clinton is gorgeous.
That's insulting.
So then,
To my sensibility or to her?
To her.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure which was being insulted. Yeah. Sorry, I was reading The First Circle today by Solzhenitsyn. And there was one point where the wife comes to visit the guy who's been in jail for like 3 years. And they sit down and he's looking at her and he realizes she looks ugly. That's the wrong thing for the guy to be thinking, you know, if he's finally getting visited by, she comes to visit him in prison and stuff.
I missed what you said. She looked what?
Ugly.
Sorry. Oh.
His wife comes to visit him in prison and he realizes she's getting old and wrinkled and, you know, so he thinks, oh, she's ugly. But
Maybe he's becoming a homosexual.
I almost took the book and threw it out in the yard, you know, when I read that. Which would have hurt the yard, because if you've seen Solzhenitsyn books, they're like, sorry.
What was the...
Anybody want it, by the way? If anybody wants Solzhenitsyn's The First Circle?
Is there any
Quick run by and pardon?
really good chapters that are just like, oh wow, it was amazing. It was like,
No.
nothing.
No, I think Solzhenitsyn was big stuff way back when the Soviet Union was,
I mean,
you know.
wait, so do you like Dostoevsky or Nabokov?
Dostoevsky, no.
You don't?
No. I don't like Henry James either.
Gosh, what did Henry James write?
Washington Square. Oh, shoot. I can't remember. The one where the new babysitter keeps seeing the ghost from the old babysitter.
Nope, never heard of it.
What's the name of that one? Oh, I can't remember it. But
Do you like
But-
Nabokov?
You say Nabokov?
I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. You're the one that's Russian.
Right, but that doesn't mean I'm right when I pronounce Nabokov.
And whatever.
Um,
I've barely read any of this stuff, but when I did, I was like, wow,
I started reading Lolita and threw that one out in the yard.
You
'Cause-
threw Lolita out in the
yes.
Wow.
Hypothetically, I threw Lolita out in the yard because I realized this is evil. This is an evil book. And I do not want to read any more of it because Aquinas is right. Just thinking about sin is the sin itself.
Oh my God.
And I was just, no. Mm-mm. But I did read Anya Strania-Chudyez, which is Nabokov's translation of Alice in Wonderland. Although that was hard to figure because Anya Strania-Chudyez is Anne in the Strange Country.
And that makes sense. Yeah.
Because of Alice, it's Anna.
Anna. But in the Strange Country, wasn't that one of the other names like it originally had?
Wonderland?
Yeah, I thought it wasn't always called Alice in Wonderland. I thought it was Alice's Adventures in a Strange Country. Was one of the names.
Was it?
Yeah. It might have just been another. It might just been the version that was translated.
But then instead of a white rabbit that's running because he's late, it was a mouse.
That's weird.
Yes, I was like, what? So that was weird.
The character is pretty mousy when you think about it. Always scurrying.
Well,
Oh,
I
it's very nice, yeah.
think Nabokov was thinking that the Russians wouldn't get the rabbit thing, but they
There's
are into
rabbits in
mice.
Russia, no? There's
I
rabbits
think-
and
I'm
hares
sure.
in Russia. Yeah, they're everywhere. They breed faster than rodents, like rats.
They're not on that Chinese island yet.
No, I'm not sure about that.
Give it time.
Give it time. Just find some rabbits swimming in the middle of the ocean.
Okay, so back to work. So this is extra, but we still use it because it's flowing part of our, we say if, then, we say that a lot. And here's another interesting aspect of this. So we have another, so let me line these up here, because we've got the dot, and that means n, or any, it means both left and right have to be true for the whole thing to be true. We have the wedge, right? That means that as long as one or the other is true, or both are true, the whole thing is true. It's only false when both the left and the right are false, right? We have the not, which negates whatever follows it, right? And then we have the horseshoe, which we refer to as if and then. Right? And then the last one we have is the tribar, which is equivalence. Right? And so what we say is P is equivalent to Q. If I'm looking at the truth table, the only time, so as long as both are true, the whole thing is true. And if both are false, the whole thing is true. It's only false when one or the other is true and the other's false, right? Because you're saying that they're equivalent, right? Well, when we look at this up here, this turns out to be it's equivalent to having both of these. And since both of those are equivalent to a version of this, basically that means that we didn't need that either. So there are some superfluous symbols in our system. It's not a bare bones system. And I'm not sure if you're doing computer coding, if you would have these. You might not. You might just have these. Because these are replaceable by combinations of these. So computers don't need them. But for translating everyday speech, we like using these. So you'll see them in logical notation for our speech. Okay. So let me look at the book.
Is there a way of translating this sort of thing back into what we were doing last week?
Well, the P and the Q are the A, E, I, O.
The P and Q are the A.
Right, because they're true or false statements. And A, E, I, O statements are the only kind of statements that are true or false. So this builds on the syllogisms. So I'm going to look at page 307. So in this chapter, Propositional Logic, we're going to introduce logical operators and translations into that sort of stuff. So we'll talk about translating. So this is where we're going to move into our everyday speech and use a system that will help us analyzing the argumentation in our everyday speech. So that's the advantage of it, right? That was the goal of it. The fact that it also became important for computers, that was unexpected, right? The inventors of this language were not thinking that someday computers were going to be using it. It was designed for human beings so that it would help us analyze our thinking better, believe it or not. Although it was very close to when computers started. If you're familiar with Alan Turing and inventing computers, you could see that the two things happened together. He was following, Bertrand Russell was not trying to create a computer language, he was trying to create a language that would enable us to think more clearly. But Alan Turing is a student of his, and Wittgenstein, someone mentioned that last week. Okay, so logical operators, what are they? Right? The definition of logical operators, page 308, special symbols that can be used as part of ordinary language statement translations, right? So and propositional logic, the basic components in propositional logic are statements. Remember, a simple statement is one that does not have any other statement or logical operator as a component. So there are A, E, I, O statements. For example, Harrisburg is the capital of Pennsylvania. That's for anything you pick. If it is the capital of Pennsylvania, then it is Harrisburg. Or anything that is Harrisburg is the capital of Pennsylvania. So that would be an A statement, right? Wednesday is hump day. How many of you love the camel? Grilled hamburgers taste delicious. Ooh, what if you're a vegan?
Vegan?
Or a vegan?
Vegan. You could still make that statement. You can have a vegan hamburger.
Or a vegan can find it delicious.
Or the Impossible Burger? Is it the Impossible Burger?
My sister's vegan and she was just telling me that it tasted too much like meat for her. Yeah, she couldn't get behind it.
It's too convincing.
Right? Yeah.
I'm going to have to try them, I guess, sooner or later. I've tried the ones in the store in the freezer. Not
And spices.
like the ones made out of black beans. Yeah, I've tried the vegan or vegan.
How long have you been
the
calling
V-
it vegan?
Are they from Vega?
There's no correct pronunciation of any void, you know.
That's true. This is true.
We're making it up. On the other hand, you should learn to approximate, because otherwise you could like ask for something and people will not know. My son-in-law was in Fayetteville, and he was asking for ice. Can I have some ice? And no one knew what the heck he was talking about. And so he changed his pronunciation and said, can I have some I'm probably not saying it right. Eyes.
Eyes?
However he said it. And then they went, oh, well, why didn't you say so? You know? I remember arriving in that town, and we went to the Marriott where we had reservations. We got there, and we didn't have reservations. So they called, and they found out that we had reservations at another Marriott somewhere else in town. And so she gave me directions to go to that other Marriott. And she said, just go out here to Row Grow, right? So we drove out and we're looking for Row Grow. And you know what? I could not find Row Grow anywhere. Turned out it was Rowan Grove. I couldn't find it. But yeah, but Fayetteville, very strange place. We discovered that if you go to the not the Marines, sorry, I didn't mean to say that. If you're the Ranger Museum in Fayetteville, you cannot leave. We got, we finished looking at the museum, we got back in the car and we drove off, and after about 5 minutes, we found ourselves arriving at the museum. And we thought, well, how did that happen? So we drove off in a different direction, and within about 5 minutes, we found ourselves driving back to the museum. It happened like 5 or 6 times. We were eventually just laughing to ourselves as we were, how do you get away from this place? It was impossible.
It's like the Truman Show.
It's terrifying.
It was crazy. Hilarious, but also crazy. It just made no sense.
Sounds like that'd be a good tactic for the all-you-can-eat buffet, because after you drive around a certain amount, you just want to eat again, so.
Yeah, but then you'd have to repay. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so simple statements are true or false, right? Compound statements have at least one simple statement and at least one logical operator. And you could say that at least one, because if I say, well, P, that's one, now it's a compound statement, because I just said not. Right? So that's, what if it's an E statement? So let's not ask that question. Because an E statement would be a simple statement. But if I put a negation in front of it, so assume that this is A, E, I, or O. But for our purposes right now, they don't want you to worry about that. Just think, well, this is a true or false statement. Now we're talking about compound statements. What do we do with them? So,
That would only work for, really just the tilde, right? Because you can't make a compound statement of.
all the others require P and Q,
Right, okay.
or P or Q, or more. We can add lots more, actually.
Sorry, I mistook what you were saying. I thought it was a blanket statement of any variable with a logical operator became a compound statement.
Well, this gets us into what is referred to as well-formed formula. What is a well-formed formula? Notice page 309, it gives you the operators, the tilde, the dot, the wedge, the horseshoe, and the tri-bar, triple bar, also known as the biconditional. And you would read it, by the way, as if and only if, the tri-bar. And in fact, you could abbreviate if and only if like this, I, F, F. So, and people actually use that. So if you see a text and they have IFF, chances are they're not misspelling if. They're using IFF to stand for if and only if. Have you ever seen that? Maybe not. Okay. So we can now use the operators to translate our 5 examples. So not the case D. And Hamlet is a tragedy and Kung Fu Panda is a comedy. H and K. Either we reduce carbon emissions or global warming will get worse, C or G. You see, are you on that page? You see where I am? Page 309, etc. Okay, so negation we talked about, or the word not, conjunction, it's the dot operator. Disjunct is what you call the wedge, or. We call it disjunct. And notice on page 311 they talk about the difference between inclusive and exclusive disjunction. The conditional statements, if and only if, notice the difference there. This is kind of interesting. There's a difference between sufficient and necessary conditions. So basically, a sufficient condition for something creates that something or causes that something. But whenever that happens, whenever you have something happen, the necessary conditions had to have happened for that to happen. But the trouble is, you could have necessary conditions without having all of the necessary conditions or the sufficient condition. So, having oxygen is a necessary condition for mammals to live. We also need water. I think, don't all mammals need water and oxygen? So, if you're drowning in the ocean, it's because you didn't have sufficient oxygen. Because you have to be able to float, etc. Or walk like Jesus on the water, right? You know how Jesus walked on the water, right? So sufficient conditions are all the conditions necessary for something to happen. The necessary conditions are the things that are necessary for that thing to happen, without which it won't happen. But just because you have some of the necessary conditions doesn't mean you have the sufficient condition for something to happen. And I don't know why we needed to point that out, but there it is. Interesting point in the text on page 319. We talk about the Stoics, Zeno of Citium, and Chrysippus of Soli, who no one ever talks about. But Zeno, we'll talk about him. He is not the same Zeno that gave us the paradoxes. This is a different Zeno. But Zeno the Stoic. Stoa is a porch. So when you look at the Greek temples that have the great big pillars and everything, that's the Stoa. That's a Stoa. And Zeno was called that because he would teach on the porch. So that's kind of cool.
Is this the guy who died by not breathing? Stopped breathing? Made his mind stop breathing, just died.
Well, if you stop breathing, you will die. But if you stop breathing without any other necessary conditions for your death, you will probably start breathing again while you're unconscious. So I doubt that anyone died just because they stopped breathing. But everyone that did die stopped breathing. Excellent example of a necessary condition for death, but not a sufficient condition for death. Thanks for bringing that up. I have a quiz question for you. Page 321, question number 10.
321.
321, question 10. But let's talk about what it's asking, because what it says is determine whether the following arrangements of operator symbols and letters are well-formed formulas. If any are not, point out the mistake. So if we're looking at number 1, and it says P or not Q, the answer is this is a well-formed formula. The computer would understand what is written there. But problem 2, R, not the case, or T. That is not a well-formed formula because you have the negation sign in front of the wedge. The negation sign has to go in front of either the R or the T. By the way, they're using R or T instead of the P's and Q's that I was using in my examples, because initially what they're talking about here are constants. So we can abbreviate, like Harrisburg is H, Pennsylvania is P, capital P, things of that sort. Number 3 is just the letter K, and that's fine. That's a well-formed formula. It just means K, right? Whatever that statement is. 4, K and parentheses P, not Q, is not a well-formed formula because there's no connector between P and Q. You can't use negation sign as the connector. Problem 5 has a star. That means the answer's in the back of the book. And it's if L, then not P, and that is a well-formed formula. That's perfectly fine. Problem 6, if L, then not the case, P or horseshoe Q. That's wrong, because you can't have two connectors one after the other. It doesn't make any sense. Problem 7, if M, whoa, but then inside the parentheses you have a horseshoe, which is wrong. That's just totally confused. 8, P or Q, but then you have the horseshoe, and the thing is, when you have two statements connected, you need to have parentheses. Otherwise, it's grammatically incorrect. So that's not a well-formed formula. Problem 9, you've got brackets around one parentheses, which is totally wrong. And then there's no connector between the P and the Q, so that's wrong. Or not R. So all sorts of problems with 9. So 9 is not well-formed formula. I'll skip 10 because that's your guess for the first quiz. 11, P, N, or Q. We just don't talk that way. That's not a well-formed formula. 12, R or T, not. No, that's not a well-formed formula. You get the idea, I guess. What is the main operator? When we're trying to figure out what the truth value of the compound statement is, we're trying to figure out the truth function of that main operator. So what is the main operator? So if I have not the case R, there's only one operator there. It's not the case. So that's fun, easy. Number 2, if I have not the case P or Q, well, there's a operator inside the parentheses, but the main operator, logical operator, is the negation sign on the outside of the parentheses, because that has power over the entire statement inside the parentheses. Number 3, that's the same as number 2 in a similar sense, because you've got the negation sign outside of the entire bracket and everything inside the bracket. So I would read that as either P or Q and R and S. But then that whole thing is negated. So you might have started it by saying it is not the case that either P or Q and R and S. That would be confusing to say in everyday speech as well. You'd have to be very careful how you accentuate your words to make sure that people understood how you were saying that, etc. Okay, so translations and the main operator. Some of these are pretty interesting. Looking at page 324, either Tracy or Becky owns a DVD player, but Sophie owns one for sure. Okay, so either Tracy or Becky owns a CD player, right? But Sophie, right? Do you actually own one of these old devices anymore? Or?
I think my laptop can handle DVDs.
Ah, there you go. I have hundreds of CDs, but apart from my computers, I have no CD players that work anymore. Oh, the cars have them. But who the heck listens to a CD in the car? Unless you're driving somewhere in Alaska where there doesn't.
Yeah, going towards Fairbanks.
Yeah, there's a couple gaps up there that. Oh well. But so notice how in translating everyday speech, how this one worked out. That's kind of interesting, I suppose.
So this would be different than the variable B?
Well, if we're looking at Tracy or Becky owns a DVD player, but Sophie owns one for sure.
Oh, right, sorry. Mixed up with this.
So here, I'm not sure if Tracy owns one or Becky owns one, but I know between the two of them, one of them has one. So T or B,
I gotcha.
but S. I know she has one.
Right.
So if we're trying to get one for the party, you can ask Tracy or Becky, but you know, go get Sophie for sure. Sophie has one. The other night, I drove into the parking lot in Freddy's here in town, and there were 3 cars, each with their windows down, with their radios blaring, playing 3 different rap songs, all at the same time, all within easy hearing distance. What a cacophony. I said that right? Cacophony?
Cacophony.
Cacophony?
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 Is it cacophony?
What a loud noise.
Cacophony. I thought I'm like 85% sure it's cacophony. Does no one else in the room know that word?
Nope. What does it mean? So, what's the opposite of cacophony? It's like if you hear a pretty
Peace.
sound. Yeah, if you hear a pretty sound or a peaceful sound, that would be like the opposite. Of
You could go on the internet now and like cacophony, and then you could hit like the little icon, and then you could hear how it's theoretically pronounced in some parts of the world.
Certainly not your parts of the world.
Well, you could always go out and get a cup of coffee.
I'm right.
How did I say it? Cacophony?
Cacophony.
Cacophony.
Like caffeine.
Cacophony. Every middle school band ever.
The hardest word ever to learn to pronounce was Strasvitya.
Strasvitya.
Because at the time that I was trying to learn it, I had just had the dentist was an officer and insisted that it was time for me to have all my wisdom teeth pulled. In Russian class. And so my face is stuffed with wads of cotton, and I remember Mr. Lapellis looking at me, Strasvitya. And he was like, Strauss wheat. He wanted me to say it correctly, but there was no way it was going to happen with all the cotton. It was just, forget it. Oh well.
That's hilarious.
Okay, so let's take a break, I suppose, if that's good.
The, just kind of learning about that word.